Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today, we're tackling some really foundational material, the genetics of bacteria and uh, their viruses. This stuff really underpins a lot of molecular biology.
It really does. And, it's not just abstract science. This is incredibly relevant right now.
Hmm.
We're facing a huge global problem with multi-drug resistant bacteria, MDR, and even extensively drug-resistant ones, XDR.
Yeah, you just have to think about something like tuberculosis, TB.
Exactly. It's a tragic, perfect case study. Back in the 40s and 50s, with antibiotics coming online, everyone thought TB was finished.
And done.
But Mycobacterium tuberculosis didn't disappear.
Nope.
Instead, we got these resistant strains. Dr. Lee Reichman called MDR-TB a ticking time bomb years ago. And, well, it's still ticking. Understanding how bacteria share genes is key to understanding why resistance spreads like wildfire.
Okay, so that's our mission. Let's unpack this source material. Why did scientists zero in on these tiny organisms, bacteria and viruses, to unlock genetics? Why not stick with Mendel's peas or fruit flies?
Well, the advantages compared to eukaryotes are just massive. First off, speed. You can get something like 10 billion bacteria growing in a single test tube overnight. Just imagine trying that scale with mice.
Right, it'd be impossible. Years, huge facilities.
Exactly. And they're structurally simple. Plus, you can grow them on totally defined media. You know exactly what chemicals are in there. So spotting a change, a mutation, becomes much, much easier. Genetic variations really stand out.
All right, let's start with the viruses then. These fascinating things that kind of blur the line between living and non-living. Like the tobacco mosaic virus, TMV, you can crystallize it like a chemical, but put it in a host cell and suddenly it's reproducing.
That paradox is central. We're focusing on bacteriophages, or just phages, the viruses that infect bacteria. Specifically the ones that go after E. coli like T4 and lambda, often written as ly.
And how do researchers actually see them working in the lab?
They plate the phages onto what's called a consolent lawn of bacteria, basically a thick, cloudy layer of bacteria covering a petri dish. Where a phage infects and kills the bacteria, it leaves a clear little circle. That's called a plaque. Think of it as a zone of destruction.
Got it. Now, T4, based on the sources, sounds like the aggressive one, a virulent phage.
Oh yeah, T4 is all about the kill. It follows a lytic cycle only. Its structure is pretty complex. This big protein head packed with double-stranded DNA, a hollow tail for injection, fibers to attach, the works.
And it works fast.
Incredibly fast.
Yeah.
Once its DNA is injected, boom, within 2 minutes it shuts down the host cell's own processes. By about 6 minutes, phage enzymes, nucleases, are chopping up the host's DNA. Around 17 minutes, new phage parts start assembling. And by 25 minutes or so, it makes lysozyme, an enzyme that bursts the cell wall, releasing about 300 new T4 viruses.
Okay, wait a second. If T4 makes enzymes to destroy the host DNA, how does it stop those enzymes from destroying its own DNA? That seems like a pretty major oversight.
That's where it gets really clever. It's a molecular arms race. T4's DNA isn't quite standard. Instead of the usual cytosine base, it uses an unusual one. 5-hydroxymethylcytosine, or HMC.
HMC.
Right. And often that HMC even has glucose molecules attached. These modifications make the T4 DNA invisible, essentially, to its own destructive nucleuses. It's protected while the host DNA gets shredded.
Wow. So it turns the host's potential defenses against it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, so T4 is the smash and grab attacker. Lambda, though, is different, more subtle.
Exactly. Lambda is a temperate phage. Its DNA is smaller, about 48,000 base pairs. When it gets inside E. coli, it circularizes. Then it has a choice. It can go lytic, like T4, or it can enter the lysogenic cycle.
Lysogeny, meaning it lies low.
Precisely. In lysogeny, the lambda DNA, now called a prophage, actually inserts itself into the E. coli's own chromosome. It becomes part of the bacterial genome.
Whoa, does it just slot in anywhere?
No, it's very specific. It's a process called site-specific recombination. The phage DNA has an attachment site at TP, and the bacterial chromosome has a corresponding site at TB. An enzyme called lambda integrase mediates this insertion.
So it integrates and then just waits.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The prophage genes needed for lysis are repressed, turned off. It just gets copied along with the host DNA. Every time the bacterium divides, it's passed down to daughter cells.
Until what? What makes it come back out?
Usually some kind of stress signal in the cell, like UV light damage. This can trigger excision, the prophage looping out of the host chromosome. This happens spontaneously sometimes too, maybe once in every 100,000 cell divisions.
And does it need special tools to get out?
Yes. Excision requires the integrase enzyme again,
Yeah.
but also another protein called lambda excisase. Once it's out, it usually enters the lytic cycle and starts making new phages.
Okay, fascinating stuff. Let's shift focus now from the predators, the phages, to the bacteria themselves. We know they're typically monoploid, just one copy of their chromosome, and they reproduce asexually just by splitting in two, right? Fission.
That monoploidy is really key. It means recombination works differently than in eukaryotes like us. There's no reciprocal exchange like in meiosis. Instead, bacterial gene transfer is almost always unidirectional. A piece of DNA from a donor goes into a recipient cell that already has a full chromosome.
And we track this using mutations. The sources list various types, like ability to use sugars or needing specific nutrients, but the resistance markers, like ampicillin resistance, AMPRA2, those seem particularly useful. Why?
Because they are fantastic selectable markers, and they're usually dominant. Imagine you're trying to see if a tiny piece of DNA transferred into a population of 1 billion recipient cells. Screening them one by one is impossible.
Right.
But if that donor DNA fragment also carries the AMPR gene, you just add ampicillin to the growth medium. Only the bacteria that successfully receive the donor DNA fragment will survive and grow. Everyone else dies. It lets you easily select for the cells that underwent recombination.
Makes sense. Now, you mentioned that donor DNA is usually a linear fragment going into a circular recipient chromosome. And there's this rule about crossovers needing to happen in pairs, an even number. Why is that so critical?
Okay, picture the bacterial chromosome as a closed circle of rope. If you want to splice in a new piece of rope, the donor DNA, you have to cut the circle in two places, remove the piece in between, and then attach the ends of your new piece to those two cut ends in the circle.
Ah, I see. Two connections, two crossover events.
Exactly. Two crossovers integrate the linear fragment and maintain the circle's integrity. If you just had one crossover, attaching one end of the linear piece to the circle, you'd break the circle and end up with one long linear molecule. Bacteria don't like that. Their enzymes would usually degrade it pretty quickly. So to keep a viable circular chromosome, you need that even number of exchanges.
That really clarifies the geometry. Okay, so bacteria need to swap DNA, and they need paired crossovers. How do they actually do it? The sources lay out three main ways: transformation, conjugation, and transduction.
Right, those are the big three parasexual processes. And experimentally, you can often tell them apart by asking two simple questions. Does adding DNase, an enzyme that degrades free DNA, stop the transfer? And is direct cell-to-cell contact required?
Let's start with the simplest, transformation, taking up naked DNA from the environment.
Yep, this is what Griffith first observed back in the 1920s with Streptococcus pneumonia, though he didn't know the mechanism then. For a bacterium like B. subtilis, which is often used to study this, to take up DNA, it needs to be in a special physiological state called competence.
Competence. Like it's ready to receive?
Sort of. It happens usually in late stages of growth, involves special proteins, even chemical signals called pheromones. When double-stranded DNA from the environment binds, typically one strand gets degraded as it enters the cell. The remaining single strand gets coated with protective proteins and then finds its homologous region on the recipient chromosome and integrates, replacing the original strand there. This creates a region called a heteroduplex. One strand is original, one is donor.
And this is useful for mapping genes. How?
Through co-transformation. Bacterial chromosomes are big, but the DNA fragments taken up during transformation are relatively small. If two genes are physically very close together on the chromosome, they have a decent chance of being on the same small fragment of transforming DNA.
Ah, so they'd be transferred together.
Frequently, yes. The closer the genes, the higher the frequency they'll be co-transformed. By measuring these frequencies, you can deduce the relative order and distance between genes.
Clever. Okay, next up, conjugation. This one requires cells to actually touch, right? And it's super important for understanding antibiotic resistance spread.
Absolutely critical. Conjugation is direct DNA transfer via a physical connection, often a pilus. Liederberg and Tatum discovered this in E. coli. The whole process is usually orchestrated by a plasmid called the F factor for fertility.
F factor.
It carries the genes needed to make the pilus and manage the transfer. A cell with the F factor plasmid is called F+. A cell without it is F. F+ can donate to F. But the really interesting ones are HFR strains.
HFR, high-frequency recombination.
You got it. In an HFR cell, the F factor isn't a separate plasmid anymore. It has actually integrated itself into the main bacterial chromosome. This usually happens via recombination between short DNA sequences called IS elements insertion sequences that are found on both the F factor and the chromosome.
So what happens when an HFR cell bumps into an F cell?
The integrated F factor still tries to transfer itself. But because it's now part of the huge bacterial chromosome, it starts transferring the chromosome itself, starting from a point within the integrated fDNA called ORAT, the origin of transfer?
Oh, chromosome.
Well, it tries to. It uses a mechanism called rolling circle replication to school out a single strand of DNA through the pilus. But the bacterial chromosome is massive. It takes about 100 minutes at 37 degrees Celsius to transfer the whole thing in E. coli. Usually the mating pair breaks apart long before that.
And that interruption, that led to a massive breakthrough, didn't it? The Woolman and Jacob experiment.
Oh, it was genius. 1957, they mixed HFR and F cells. Then at specific time points, they violently agitated the mixture, stuck it in a blender, essentially to break the mating pairs apart.
It's a blender.
Yep, it stopped the DNA transfer dead. Then they tested the recipient F cells to see which genes they had received from the HFR donor. What they found was remarkable.
What was it?
Genes always transferred in a specific linear order. For example, maybe the Throy plus and Lu plus genes always showed up in recipients after about 8 minutes. Then maybe AZ resistance after 9 minutes, sorghum resistance after 10, Lac plus after about 18, Gal plus after 25, and so on.
So the time it took for a gene to appear told them its position.
Exactly. It allowed them to construct the first genetic map of the E. coli chromosome, measured not in physical distance, but in minutes of transfer time. The whole map was defined as 100 minutes long, representing the full circle, a landmark experiment.
Incredible. And there's another twist with the F factor, F prime factors.
Right, F factors. These arise from sloppy excision. Sometimes when an integrated F factor loops out of the HFR chromosome to become a plasmid again, it makes a mistake and picks up some adjacent bacterial genes along with it.
So it's an F plasmid carrying extra bacterial DNA.
Precisely. And when this F factor transfers to an F cell, a process sometimes called sexduction, it creates a recipient that is partially diploid. It has its own copy of those bacterial genes on its chromosome and a second copy on the incoming F plasmid.
Why is that useful?
It's invaluable for genetic testing, especially for determining dominance. You can put a mutant allele on the chromosome and a wild-type allele in the F, or vice versa, in the same cell and see which phenotype prevails.
Very neat. Okay, third and final mechanism, transduction. This one uses a middleman, a bacteriophage.
Correct. Discovered by Zinder and Lederberg initially in Salmonella using phage P22, but P1 in E. coli is another classic example. This is gene transfer mediated by a virus. There are two main types.
Okay.
First is generalized transduction. This is basically a packaging error by the phage. When new phages are being assembled inside the dying host cell, sometimes the packaging machinery accidentally stuffs a random piece of the host's bacterial DNA into a phage head instead of the phage's own genome.
So the phage particle is just carrying bacterial genes.
Exactly. It's non-infectious in terms of making more phages, but it can still attach to a new bacterium and eject that piece of bacterial DNA.
Yeah.
Because the DNA fragment is random, potentially any bacterial gene can be transferred this way, though the frequency for any specific gene is pretty low.
Okay, so that's generalized. What's the other type?
Specialized transduction. And this brings us back to our friend, the temperate phage lambda. Remember how it integrates at a specific site at key B in the E. coli chromosome?
Yeah, near the gal and biogenes, you said?
Right. Well, just like the F factor can excise sloppily, sometimes when the lambda prophage excises from the host chromosome, it makes a mistake and takes adjacent bacterial DNA, specifically the gal, galactose utilization, or biosynthesis genes, while leaving some of its own phage DNA behind.
Ah, so it creates a defective phage carrying specific bacterial genes.
Precisely. Particles like UdGal, a defective carrying gal, can only transfer those specific genes. They can't complete a lytic cycle on their own because they're missing essential phage genes, but they are very efficient at transducing gal. You can even generate what's called high-frequency transduction, HFT mysate, which is full of these specialized transducing particles.
Okay, that's a fantastic overview of the three main ways bacteria swap genes. If we had to boil it down, what's the single biggest takeaway message from all this?
I think the bottom line is that bacteria aren't just passively waiting for random mutations. They have these active, sophisticated mechanisms, transformation, conjugation, transduction, to acquire new genetic information from each other. This allows for incredibly rapid adaptation and evolution.
And that speed and efficiency, unfortunately, bring us right back to where we started. This very genetic exchange is what powers the spread of things like our plasmids carrying multiple antibiotic resistance genes. It's why a resistance trait that emerges in one place can spread globally so quickly. The mechanisms we've just discussed are quite literally a major public health challenge.
They absolutely are. And here's something to think about, tying back to that Woolman and Jacob experiment. We know the whole E. coli chromosome takes 100 minutes to transfer via conjugation. But what really happens genetically inside that recipient cell when the transfer gets cut off halfway, say at 50 minutes, that cell receives only part of a genome. How does it cope with that partial transfer? And just how much did researchers learn about the genome's layout simply by studying those incomplete transfers?
That's a great point. Often it's the interruptions and imperfections that teach us the most. Thank you for guiding us through these complex but crucial mechanisms. We hope this deep dive gives you a solid foundation for understanding the molecular world.